In the Viking era, was it more effective with shields to use an axe or to use a sword? We're going to look at the principal advantages of each. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I'm going to keep this one relatively brief and relatively simple. We could spiral out into all sorts of other possible reasons why you might choose one or the other, but I want to keep clarity of message here and put what I believe are the top most important reasons why you might choose an axe or might choose a sword. And the weapons featured in this video are one of the weapons from my new Elements line, which more about that to follow soon, coming from Windless, and a brilliant axe made by Tord over at Thor's Forge, based on an original in Sweden. Now, just briefly before we go into the main points of why you would choose one or the other, we should mention the economic factor, because I absolutely know that some people will immediately post that down below. They'll say, oh, well, swords are really expensive and axes are kind of cheap and pretty much anyone who has a farm can afford an axe. And that is true. However, it's also kind of irrelevant to this question, because the simple fact is that lots of people who could afford swords chose to use axes. So very clearly there are some advantages to using axes, and axes were sometimes chosen as a tactical option with and against shields, as opposed to the sword. And in some cases the person using an axe would also be wearing a sword. And I also just want to point out that while swords were pretty expensive and pretty elite in the Viking era, by the time we get to the Norman period, you know, 1000 AD, 1100 AD, First Crusade kind of period, and then you start to find that swords actually aren't that high status anymore. So much so that by the time we get to the 13th or 14th century, it seems that pretty much any common soldier can lay their hands on a sword. It might not be a great sword, it might be a cheaper sword, it might be a rusty sword, and rusty swords are mentioned in the inventories and sources incidentally, but swords weren't as expensive as some people make out. Anyway, let's get back to the main points of why would you choose either the one-handed axe or a one-handed sword to use with and against shields. So firstly, the sword. So to me, the absolute most important and principal advantage of using a sword in this style of combat is that it's more nimble. It's as simple as that. It's really obvious, but it is we could list probably a dozen other reasons, but that is the most important thing. When you've got a shield up in front of you like this, and you're trying to find angles around, the sword is so much quicker and so much more agile than an axe is. So in other words, you can feint, you can do false attacks, that is, you can steer around, you can wind around, you can do all sorts of subtle and very, very quick movements with a sword that you simply can't do with a top-heavy weapon. It's not rocket science to point out that the axe is mostly balanced towards the end, and the sword is actually balanced towards your hand. Now, admittedly, and this, you might not be aware of this, all viewers actually, but in the Viking era, swords actually vary hugely. While they tend to have a fairly similar format, a fairly short grip, and this sort of capital I-shaped hilt in various detail forms, but fundamentally like this, and they all tend to have similar sort of blades. Sometimes they've got a little bit more taper, sometimes they're a little bit more pointy, but generally speaking, they are relatively parallel-edged, broad cutting blades that you can also thrust with. So while they might superficially look similar to each other, all the swords in this period, if you actually look at the stats, and I recommend you go and get Ian Pearce's fantastic book, Swords of the Viking Age, if you go and check out the stats in there, you get not only size differences, length of blade and length of hilt, but weight. And so we should point out that while some swords, like the one that this is based on, which is in the Irish Museum in Dublin, there are examples, particularly from Norway and Sweden, which are particularly heavy as 4 pounds, some of them. So while this is a light one, there are heavy ones. So not all swords are light and nimble, but overall swords are more nimble than an axe, because an axe has all of its weight, although its literal weight might be less than the sword, all of the weight is at the end of the lever. That can obviously also be an advantage, but we'll get to that in a second. So the absolute most important headline point is they are more nimble than axes, and in fact they are really nimble weapons for the amount of punch that they pack. But there are other advantages. I quickly mention a few of those just in case you're not aware of them. One, that you've got two edges, so they can do things in two directions, which axes generally speaking can't. They've got very long edges, which means anywhere you hit something along here, it will do really nasty damage to people's bodies because it's a great big long blade, of course, on both sides. So you've got a lot of blade, whereas an axe only has a short amount of blade. You've also got a more useful, shall I say, thrusting point. It's not to say that you can't thrust with certain types of axe. You can, of course, jab people with the tip there, but it's not going to do an awful lot unless it hits them in the face. If you jab someone in the body, or hit their mail shirt or their arms or their legs, you're only going to do very superficial damage. These are obviously better thrusting weapons, which, coming around the edges of shields, can be really quite useful things. And on that note, a blade is a long, smooth object which is able to slide around and over the edges of shields, including all of the flats, in ways that, frankly, pole weapons, and particularly axes, don't really do, because they've got too many projections and you don't have a great thrusting point at the end anyway. Plus, you've got a bit of hand protection, which protects you from shields as well as other people's weapons. So these are just some of the reasons why swords have some other advantages. But I really want you, from my opinion anyway, to go away with the headline that the most important advantage of the sword is how quick and nimble it is. So that raises the question, if someone has access to swords, either they can buy them or they can loot them from fallen enemies, why wouldn't they all go to swords instead of axes? Well, axes do have their own distinct advantages over and above swords, regardless of their economic value. But I do want to mention once again that economic value does mean that if you can equip a load of people with axes instead of swords, because you don't have access to swords, then clearly that's what you're going to do. So undoubtedly, sometimes in history, the reason that people had axes was for economic reasons. However, putting that aside, let's assume that they can get swords or do have swords. Why would you choose an axe instead of a sword? Well, yet again, like the sword, there are about a dozen good reasons why you might choose to use an axe. But I think, and this might be controversial, I think the most important reason for choosing an axe in a style of combat where axes are omnipresent and really dominant and really dictate the whole nature of the warfare, whether we're in shield walls or fighting in open order. The fact is, we've got these large shields that can be held far from the body and provide a huge amount of protection, both from hand weapons and missile weapons. And I think in that context, the primary advantage of the axe is this. It can hook, okay? Now, over the years, I've done a fair amount of shield stuff. I've also trained people for the BBC for some Roman stuff with Roman scutum, Roman weapons and this kind of stuff. And overall, we have found that hooking, it doesn't really matter what it's with. It could be an axe, it could be a warhammer, it could be the pommel of your sword, the grip of your sword, or bits of your body. But hooking and grabbing a shield is an incredibly potent thing to do in a world where shields exist. Now, it's not a trump card. It doesn't instantly win you the combat, of course, because very often when a shield is hooked, you can rotate it and yield to that in order to detach yourself. There's always, any technique has a counter. There's always a way out of it. However, the fact that anything with a projecting blade on it, or hook or spike like this, has the ability to pull and to push, remember, you can push with the tip like this, you can pull with the beard like that, that's called the beard, the bottom of the axe. That is an incredibly important thing in a world where shields are dominant and shields exist. Particularly so in the Viking era, because almost all shields, maybe not if we go to the Byzantine Empire or like North Africa, but if we stay in Europe for the most part, Northern Europe, pretty much all shields are boss gripped. That means that they pivot. Now this is both a strength and a weakness. The biggest strength of the boss gripped shield is you can hold it far away from your body and it projects so far in front of your hand, it offers huge amounts of protection. But much as with the Roman scutum, the disadvantage of the boss grip shield is you've only got the strength of your hand holding it, which means that it can quite easily be manipulated in the hand. Now, as I say, there's always strengths to go with weaknesses, and that can also be a kind of nimbleness and the fact you can move it around and lots of change direction on it and do sorts of other things like that. But It is a weakness when we're talking about hooking, because it means whether a person is pushing with the end of their axe or pulling with the bottom of the axe, it means that so long as you get the right pivot point anywhere around here or around there, rather than directly in line with the hand, it will manipulate the shield in ways that for the most part the person using the shield isn't going to want. Now briefly, just to mention some other advantages of the axe, because I think they are worth mentioning briefly. Most people, I think, would have perhaps assumed that the main advantage of the axe that I would have mentioned comes back to, and ironically, it's almost the opposite of the sword, the fact that it is relatively unwieldy and top heavy means that it hits with a hell of a lot of force. Now that is particularly useful against helmets and mail shirts and people's bodies and basically anything armoured, because it's going to have more effect with a strike than a sword will. Okay, so with a simple strike into someone's body with a mail shirt, an axe will generally on average do more damage than just hitting them with a sword, because the sword is light and doesn't transfer much energy. So ironically, the fact that I would say the strength of the sword is its nimbleness, the relative lack of nimbleness of the axe is actually a massive strength. Moreover, these shields were made of planks, and if you're repeatedly smashing a shield anywhere around the rim or the face, you can, of course, I would say on average, destroy a shield more easily with an axe than with a sword. But that being said, while you could perhaps in theory destroy either with either weapon, really trying to sort of beat your way through a shield and cut a shield to pieces is not the most effective way of defeating an enemy. The most effective way of defeating an enemy is hitting them really quickly or stabbing them in a place where they haven't defended themselves adequately. So using the weapon against the body is always going to be more effective than using the weapon against the shield. So yes, strength of hitting is a massive advantage, whether against the shield or whether against the body, but I think particularly in this context of the shield fight, the shield wall, the war where everybody has got massive shields, hooking and pushing is actually more important for the axe than just striking power. Another advantage worth mentioning very quickly for the axe is the fact that it strikes with the head of the weapon. That means that the literal length of the weapon is the reach that you're hitting with. Now the downside to that is you've only got a small blade to hit people with. Let's put the shield down for a second. If you hit people accidentally here because they stepped a bit too close or you stepped a bit too close, obviously it's just hitting them with a stick. You have to hit them with the blade in order to do the axe damage with it. But assuming you do that, you've actually got quite a long reach. So much so, with swords, generally speaking, we strike about down here, about the third quarter. Actually, axes, pound for pound, axes have a pretty good reach compared to a sword. If you are holding them far back here, and of course they hit with a lot of power, so they've got pretty good reach, they hit with a lot of power. Another potential advantage is against spears. Now, many people will find it difficult using a single sword against a spear, and for this reason, some people on the internet, I think, have overplayed the effectiveness of spears because they do a bit of sparring and they keep getting tagged by the spear. Okay. However, in reality, with sharp blades, and particularly when you throw shields into the mix, it changes things a lot. And as soon as you have a massive shield up here, it's actually far more difficult for the spearmen because you close down all of their lines. So long as you're willing to get in close and quickly with the sword, it works pretty well against spears. But what I would say is against axes, while the axe is less nimble, it again has the ability to hook. So if you can try and catch a spear and hook it, potentially, if you do it right, it could be advantageous in that moment to have that hooking ability against a spear as well. And just one final weird kind of tangential thinking advantage of an axe, it's the fact that you can hold it at various points up the shaft. So yes, indeed, you could reach out with a cast blow from a very, very long way away with the end of the shaft, but if you come in close, you can easily slip up here, and you've now got a really quick little hatchet and a hooking device at the back, a bit like a Langmesser. So this weapon is quite versatile in that you can switch from being almost a tomahawk size to being sword reach very, very quickly. And you can use it in a number of different ways. You could even, if you were defending against a spear, to close in. You could even use the bottom end of the shaft together with the shield as you charge in, and then lengthen it up as you come in for the strike. So a very versatile way of gripping, and of course with the Viking era sword, you pretty much only have one way of holding it. So there we go, I'm going to wrap it up there. But the headlines for me are, and you might disagree with this, if you do, post down below, because I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts, your experiences are with these two weapons. Your mileage might vary to mine, that's absolutely fine. But overall, the sword, the advantage is speed and nimbleness, either to cut or to thrust. So really, really versatile and nimble and quick. The axe, overall, most people I think would have said power. However, for the answer for this specific question, my main advantage is hooking, either pushing or pulling against shields and creating openings. Anyway, what do you think? Do you agree, disagree? It's fine either way. I'll be interested to see your comments down below. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It massively helps people seeing these videos. If you've got friends that might be interested in this stuff as well, then tell them about it. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon for another video. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.